Persian throne room, marble columns rising 40 feet into torchlight, and there, at the far end, gallows, a noose of braided rope turning slowly in the draft. A man in royal robes ascends the wooden steps. His name is Haman. He is the last Amalekite, and he is about to die on gallows he built for someone else. But this war started 1,500 years earlier, with a woman nobody wanted. One bloodline, 7 attacks across a millennium and a half, one divine command given about no other nation on earth. What did the Amalekites do that was so unforgivable? And why does their story start? Not with a sword, but with a rejected woman standing outside a tent in the desert. By the end of this video, you will understand the single most relentless enemy in all of Scripture and why God said something about them he said about nobody else. If that sentence just made you lean in, you already know you should subscribe, because this is not a story you have heard before. Not like this. Genesis chapter 36, verse 12, a genealogy, the kind of passage you skip. But the text is precise about this. Timnah was a concubine of Eliphaz, Esau's son. She bore Amalek to Eliphaz. One verse, 40 words in English, and it detonates across 15 centuries of history. Esau, the rejected twin, the man who sold his birthright for a bowl of stew. His son Eliphaz takes a woman named Timnah, not as wife, as concubine. But here is what Genesis does not tell you, and what the Talmud preserves. Sanhedrin 99b records that Timnah was a Horite princess. Genesis 36:22 confirms it. She was the sister of Lotan, a chieftain of the cave-dwelling people of Seir. She was royalty, and she wanted in. The Talmud says Timnah sought to convert, to join the family of Abraham, to attach herself to the God of Israel. The patriarchs rejected her, turned her away. So she made a choice. The Talmud records her words. Listen to them carefully. Better a handmaid to this nation than a noblewoman of another. That is not humility. That is wounded pride sharpened into a blade. She could not enter Abraham's family through the front door, so she crawled through the back, as concubine to Esau's son. A princess reduced to a secondary wife in a bitter man's household. And from that rejection, a son. His name is Amalek. This was not just a birth. This was a declaration of war across centuries. The wound of a woman turned away became a child, and that child became a tribe, and that tribe became the single most persistent enemy the people of God would ever face. Think of it, the wound that walks. That is what Amalek becomes. Rejection, given legs, given teeth, given a name. Not a nation born from conquest or covenant, a nation born from a door slammed shut. And the wound does not heal. It walks out of Esau's tent in the body of a boy, and it never stops walking. Look at this place. Esau's encampment in the land of Seir. Crimson sandstone cliffs rising like walls of dried blood. Gold light pouring through canyon gaps at sunset. Purple shadows pooling in the valleys. Goat hair tents stretched across a plateau. Herds of sheep and goats dotting the hillsides. It is beautiful, prosperous, and it is poisoned at the root. Because Esau's household runs on grievance, the stolen blessing, the lost birthright, the brother who took everything. And you need to see this next detail. At the edge of camp, the toddler Amalek sits in the red dust, turning a bronze blade in his small hands. The edge catches the last sunlight. Behind him, far to the west, a column of dust on the horizon, faint, massive, moving. Nobody in the camp pays it any attention, not yet. Now here is the Hebrew. And this is where the name becomes prophecy. Some scholars connect Amalek to two roots, am, meaning people, and lakak, meaning to lick up, to lap, to devour. A people who devour. The name is not just a label, it is a warning written into a birth certificate. A people defined by consumption. They take, they strip, they leave nothing behind. You will see this pattern repeat 7 times across Scripture. 7. 400 years pass in silence. The text says nothing. No record, no mention, just the slow multiplication of a people in the desert of the Negev, sharpening bronze, breeding horses, nursing a hatred passed from mother to son like milk. 400 years. And then the dust columns appears. The camera pulls back. The child is gone. In his place, warriors. Amalekite fighters crouched behind boulders on a ridge, bronze spears across their knees, eyes fixed on something below and to the west. Their faces are patient, predatory. They have been watching the dust column for days. They know what it is. Hundreds of thousands of people, moving slowly, and at the back of that column, the weak, the old, the ones who cannot keep up. The wound that walks has found its target. 1,500 years of war begin here. With a rejected woman's grandson watching from a ridge, a bronze blade in his hand, and a column of God's people stretched out below him like a feast. A people who devour. The name is the prophecy. Now shift your eyes. That dust column from the north, that is Israel. 2 million souls moving through the Sinai like a river of flesh and faith. But do not look at the front of the column. Look at the back, because that is where the Amalekites are looking. The stragglers, hundreds of them. An old man leaning on his grandson's shoulder. A pregnant woman sitting on a rock, unable to walk another step. Children carrying bundles too heavy for their arms. The lame, the sick, the ones who could not keep up. Deuteronomy 25 will remember them with a single Hebrew word, zanav, to tail, to cut off the tail. This was not a military term, it was a butcher's term. This was not a battle, this was a harvest of the helpless. The Amalekites did not ride toward the armed men at the front. They came from behind the rocks like jackals descending on a wounded animal, and they fell on the people who could not run. Screams echo off the canyon walls, bronze on bone, dust rising so thick you cannot tell the living from the fallen. And half a mile ahead, the vast column of Israel keeps marching forward, unaware. The word reaches Moses, and Moses turns to a young man. Barely tested, never commanded troops. His name is Joshua. Moses speaks with weary authority. Choose men for us and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. Joshua says nothing. He simply turns and begins walking through the camp, pointing at men. This one, that one, you, come. His first command, no speech, no war cry, just silence and selection. Joshua gathers his men in the failing light and waits for dawn. Dawn. Joshua leads his men into the valley at Rephidim. The clang of bronze on bronze splits the morning air. Dust and blood, men falling, men rising. Joshua fights like a man who has never learned to be afraid, because he has not yet learned what he should fear. Above him, on the hilltop, Moses raises the staff of God over his head, and Israel begins to prevail. But then the arms drop. Moses is 80 years old. His muscles tremble, his shoulders burn, and when his hands fall, Joshua feels it before he sees it. The Amalekites surge forward. Men who were retreating suddenly charge. The line buckles. Joshua looks up at the hill and understands. The battle is not in his hands. It never was. Aaron and Hur find a stone. They sit Moses on it. Each man takes one arm and holds it up. Picture this. The fate of an entire nation hanging on the trembling arms of an 80-year-old man propped up by two friends on a rock. The wound that walks had found Israel's weakest point. But God's answer was not a stronger sword. It was lifted hands. The sun sets blood red over Rephidim. Joshua defeats Amalek with the edge of the sword. But the real climax is not in the valley. It is in what God says next. Exodus 17:14. God speaks to Moses, "Write this as a memorial in a book, and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven." The text is precise about this. God does not say he will destroy Amalek. He says he will blot out their remembrance. The Hebrew is macha, to wipe, to erase, not just death, erasure, as if they never existed. God said this about no other nation on earth. Verse 16, "The Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." Moses builds an altar and calls it Yahweh Nissi. The Lord is my banner, not the Lord was my banner. Is, present tense, ongoing, unfinished. Why would God single out one tribe for eternal war? What made this attack different from every other enemy Israel would face? Was it the method? Targeting the defenseless? Was it the timing? Striking a people fresh from slavery, still learning to trust God? Or was it something deeper? Something about what Amalek represented? An enemy that does not attack your strength. It attacks your faith at its thinnest point. You know what it feels like to be attacked when you are weakest, not when you are strong and ready, but when you are exhausted, vulnerable, barely holding on. The thing that comes for you at 3 in the morning. The thought that finds you after the loss, after the diagnosis, after the betrayal. That is the Amalek pattern. And it has not changed in 3,400 years. The archaeological site of Rephidim. Most scholars place it near modern Faron Oasis in the southwestern Sinai. You can find it on a map. The canyon walls still stand. The rocks the Amalekites hid behind are still there. The place where lifted hands turned, the tide has not moved. But the story does not end at Rephidim. 40 years later, a pagan prophet named Balaam stands on a ridge overlooking the wilderness. He has been hired to curse Israel. Instead, he opens his mouth and speaks words he does not want to say. Numbers 24:20. Amalek was the first among the nations, but its end shall be utter destruction. Balaam spoke this 40 years after Rephidim. The Amalekites would not hear the verdict for another 400 years. But the sentence was already written. The wound that walks was still moving. And God was still watching. 400 years. Let that number settle in your chest. 400 years after Rephidim, after Moses lowered his arms and the blood dried on the sand. Amalek kept coming. Not once, not twice. Generation after generation, the wound that walks returned. Judges 3:13, the text is precise. Amalekites join King Eglon of Moab. They ride into Israelite territory together. 18 years of occupation. The wound was not healing. It was spreading. Every generation it returned with new allies, new methods, the same hatred. Then it gets worse. Judges 6, the Midianite-Amalekite coalition. The text says, "Whenever Israel planted crops, Midian and Amalek and the people of the east would come up against them. They would encamp and devour the produce of the land. They would come like locusts in number." The text compares them to locusts, not for their numbers alone, but for what locusts do. They leave nothing, not a stalk, not a seed, not hope. And then the ridge turns black with riders. The same field, same angle, black stubble and ash where gold once waved. Livestock gone, granaries empty, and somewhere in the ruins, A farmer named Gideon decides he will thresh his wheat in a wine press, underground in the dark, because he is too afraid to do it in the open. Night, a wine press carved into rock. Gideon crouches inside, beating wheat against rough stone with bleeding hands. Grain dust floats in a shaft of moonlight that cuts through the narrow opening above. The air smells of copper and chaff. His eyes dart to every sound. Wind through scrub brush, a distant jackal, a stone shifting. He is not a warrior. He is a farmer hiding food from raiders, like a man hiding bread from rats. A rat scurries across the grain pile. Gideon flinches violently, snatches a sickle from the stone ledge, blade out, breathing hard. Silence, just the rat, chewing. He looks down at his own hands. They are shaking. And then, a sound no one expects. Gideon laughs, a broken, bitter, half-choked laugh that echoes off the stone walls. Mighty warrior, he whispers it to himself. The sickle drops, his voice cracks. The angel called me a mighty warrior. He presses his forehead against the cold stone, and then quieter, the words barely leaving his mouth. If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened? Where are all his wonders that our fathers told us about? This is not a bold challenge. This is a man alone in a hole, whispering to God through clenched teeth, not sure anyone is listening. You have been in that wine press, maybe not with wheat and a sickle, but you have hidden in the dark, doing something small and desperate, wondering where the God of your parents went. Wondering if the stories were just stories. That is where God finds Gideon, not on a mountaintop, in a hole. And God does something insane. He tells Gideon to raise an army. Gideon gathers 32,000 men, and God says, too many. Send home the afraid. 22,000 leave. God says, still too many. He cuts the army to 300. 300 men against a coalition, the text says, covered the valley like locusts. You have heard this story in Sunday school, but have you felt the math? 300 against an army like locusts. That is not faith. That is insanity. Unless God is the variable you are not counting. The Hebrew word for what God does here is yasha, to deliver, to save. It shares a root with the name Joshua, with the name Jesus. Deliverance is not a concept, it is a person. Midnight, Judges 7:19, the jars shatter. 300 torches blaze at once across the ridgeline. 300 rams' horns scream into the dark, and the valley below erupts. The Midianite Amalekite camp tears itself apart. Men stumble over tent ropes, slashing at shadows. The text says they turned their swords on each other. God did not need 32,000 soldiers. He needed 300 jars of clay and the darkness. And Gideon, the man who flinched at a rat, who laughed at the word warrior, who whispered his doubts into cold stones, stands on the ridge, still watching God work. His hands are not shaking anymore. But here is what the Sunday school version leaves out. The Amalekites scatter. They flee. They are defeated. But they are not destroyed. And this is the question that should haunt you. Why does God keep defeating them without finishing them? Why the delay? Is mercy being offered? Or is something else being tested? The Talmud, Pesachim 118b, preserves a tradition that Amalek's hatred was unlike other enemies of Israel. Other nations fought for land, for resources, for power. Amalek fought to erase. The rabbis said Amalek attacked, not despite knowing God was with Israel, but because of it. This was not geopolitics. This was theology with a sword. 300 years after Gideon, God gives the order to finish it. He gives it to a king, and the king flinches, Not from fear, like Gideon, but from greed. And that single act of disobedience, one king sparing what God said to destroy, will echo all the way to a Persian gallows 600 years later. 400 years after Rephidim, 300 years after Gideon hid in that wine press. The sentence God pronounced through Balaam is finally being executed, and God chose Saul, the tallest man in Israel, the king the people begged for, to swing the blade. Samuel stands before him, old now. His voice carries the weight of decades of prophecy, and he delivers the command with no softness, no qualification. Now go and strike Amalek, and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them. The Hebrew is cherem, total destruction, devoted to God, everything. Livestock, possessions, people. Return to the divine court like evidence after a trial. This is not war. This is surgery. God is cutting out a cancer that has metastasized for 4 centuries, and he is handing the scalpel to a king. Saul marches south. 200,000 foot soldiers. The campaign is devastating. Amalekite strongholds fall. The text says he struck them from Havilah to Shur. And then, one verse, and everything unravels. 1 Samuel 15:9. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, and of the oxen, and of the fattened calves and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. Picture this: Agag, king of the Amalekites, walking through the Israelite camp in chains, but alive, head high, fat sheep bleating in makeshift pens around him, and Saul standing in the middle of it all, surveying the spoils with a smile on his face. This was not mercy. This was theft. Saul kept what God said to burn. Samuel arrives at Gilgal, and Saul greets him. Listen to this. Saul greets him with confidence. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. Samuel stops walking. His face does not show anger. It shows something worse: grief. And then he says the line that has echoed through 3,000 years of theology. What then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of the oxen that I hear? Saul stammers, blames the people, says they kept the animals to sacrifice to the Lord your God. And Samuel delivers the verdict with devastating simplicity. To obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you from being king. The kingdom, torn from him, not on a battlefield, in a conversation. Now I need to talk to you directly, not about Saul, about you, because you have done this, not with sheep, with something else. God asked you to let go of something completely, and you kept the best parts. You called it wisdom. You called it moderation. God called it rebellion. The bleating is still in your ears. You just learned to ignore it. Then Samuel says, bring Agag, the king of the Amalekites, here to me. And Agag comes. The text uses a Hebrew word, me'adanot, that scholars debate. Some translate it cheerfully, others delicately, as if walking on soft ground. Either way, Agag believes the worst is over. He speaks, surely the bitterness of death is past. He is wrong. Samuel looks at him and says, as your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. And Samuel hews Agag in pieces before the Lord at Gilgal, the old prophet's robes, splattered. Let that sit. Samuel was not a warrior. He was a priest. He did what the king would not. And then the text says something that should stop you cold. Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king. Forced pause. God regretted. The Hebrew is Naham. He grieved. The creator of the universe looked at the king. Israel demanded and felt grief. Not surprise, grief, because he knew what Saul's flinch would cost. Because Saul's failure had a consequence he never saw. He did not destroy all the Amalekites. Some survived, and decades later they came back. 1 Samuel 30, David, not yet king, living in exile among the Philistines, returns to his base at Ziklag and finds smoke. The Amalekites raided Ziklag, burned it to the ground, took every woman, every child, David's 2 wives, Ahinoam and Abigail, gone. His men's families, gone. David falls to his knees in the ash. The text says they wept until they had no more strength to weep. And then his own men, the men who followed him into exile, who fought beside him, they talked of stoning him. Everything is gone. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. He does not collapse. He does not negotiate. He pursues. His men find an Egyptian slave, abandoned by the Amalekite raiders, left to die. 3 days without food or water. David feeds him, and the slave leads them straight to the Amalekite camp. They find them spread across the open ground, eating, drinking, dancing, celebrating the plunder from Ziklag and the Philistine lands. David strikes from twilight to the evening of the next day. 400 young Amalekites escape on camels. Everyone else falls, and the text delivers the line, David recovered all. Nothing was missing, small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything. David brought back everything. David did what Saul would not. He finished the fight, and he recovered what the enemy stole. Remember that. What you refuse to confront does not disappear. It regroups, it comes back, and it takes what you love most. But the story has one more turn. Saul dies on Mount Gilboa, falls on his own sword after the Philistines overwhelm him. And who runs to David with the news? 2 Samuel, chapter 1. A young man. He brings Saul's crown and armlet. He claims he killed the king, expecting a reward. David asks one question. Where are you from? The young man answers, I am the son of a stranger, an Amalekite. Let that land, an Amalekite, the very enemy Saul was supposed to destroy, now claims to have destroyed Saul. David speaks with quiet fury. How is it you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? And he executes him. The crown is cold in David's hands. Blood-stained metal, the weight of a kingdom Saul lost because he would not obey. The wound Saul refused to heal came back and killed him. That is what happens when you spare what God says to destroy. It does not thank you. It does not stay where you left it. It waits. It gathers strength. And it finishes you. The Amalekite cancer Saul left alive metastasized. It burned Ziklag. It stole David's family. And it circled back to claim Saul's crown from his corpse. But even David's sword did not end it. Amalekite blood survived. 400 escaped on camels that night at Ziklag. And 500 years later, that blood surfaced in the most dangerous place imaginable. The inner court of a Persian emperor, a man named Haman. The text calls him the Agagite. The wound that walks had entered the throne room. Esther chapter 3, verse 1. Read it slowly. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite. The text does not say Haman the Persian. It says Haman the Agagite. That single word reaches back through 1,000 years of scripture. Past Gideon's winepress, past the screams at Rephidim, all the way to the king Samuel hewed at Gilgal. Agag's bloodline survived. The wound that walks had entered the throne room of the most powerful empire on earth, and the ruins of Susa. Haman's court still stand in modern Iran. You can visit them. Google Shush, Khuzestan province. The pillars that held up the room where this happened are still there, broken but standing. The story left fingerprints in stone. Mordecai refuses to bow. Every official in the king's gate drops to the ground when Haman passes. Every knee bends, except one. An old Jew sits upright, eyes forward, hands still, and Haman's rage. The text is precise about this. He disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, so Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, not one man, an entire people, because one man would not kneel. Esther 3:7. Haman casts pur. Lots to choose the date of genocide. Listen, dice clatter across a marble floor. They tumble, they spin, they stop. The 12th month, Adar. One man's wounded pride and an entire people sentenced to die on a date chosen by dice. And in a side room of Haman's household, a servant braids rope. Just rope. Thick, pale, ordinary. His hands work steadily, twisting fiber over fiber. He does not know what it is for. Not yet. Mordecai's message reaches Esther behind the palace walls. Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Such a time as this. Not comfort, not safety, not the crown and the silk and the perfumed chambers. This. The moment when your entire people face annihilation and you are the only one close enough to the king to speak. Esther's response. 5 words. If I perish, I perish. She stands in her chamber and begins removing her jewelry. A gold earring, placed on the table. A bracelet, unclasped, a necklace. Lifted away, each piece a surrender, silk rustling in silence. Her hands are still, not trembling. She is not brave because she is unafraid. She is brave because she is terrified and goes anyway. You know the difference. The second banquet. Wine poured. Ahasuerus leans forward. What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And Esther opens her mouth and says what no one in that room expects. If I have found favor in your sight, O king, let my life be granted me and the life of my people. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed. The room goes silent. Ahasuerus' face changes. Who is he? Where is he? Who dared to do this? Esther's finger extends toward Haman. A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman. The king storms from the room, and Haman, the Agagite, the last son of a bloodline that attacked grandmothers at Rephidim, falls on Esther's couch, begging for his life. The king returns, sees it, and a eunuch named Harbona speaks. Matter of fact, almost casual. Words that land like a thunderclap. Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai are standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high. The king's answer, 3 words. Hang him on it. The rope that a servant braided in a side room, just rope, just fiber, is now a noose, and it tightens around the neck of the man who made it. But God was not finished. Esther chapter 9. On the 13th of Adar, the very date Haman's dice chose, the Jews are permitted to defend themselves, and on that day, the people marked for slaughter become the people who prevail. The day chosen for their extinction becomes the day of their deliverance. The dice Haman cast were loaded by God. The Hebrew in Deuteronomy 25:19 is macha, to blot out, to wipe away, to erase the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Haman is the last Agagite named in Scripture. After Purim, the bloodline vanishes from the biblical record. The erasure God promised at Rephidim was completed, not by an army, but by a queen who said, "If I perish, I perish." The Talmud in Megillah 13 records that Haman's downfall was orchestrated measure for measure. Middah keneged middah. The very instrument of intended destruction became the instrument of justice. The gallows built for a Jew held an Agagite. Centuries later, Jesus would say, "Do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul." Esther lived that sentence before it was spoken. Now, I need to talk to you directly. Not about Amalek. About you, Amalek attacked the weak, the stragglers, the ones falling behind. You know what attacks you when you are weakest. Not when you are in church, not when you are strong, but at 2 a.m., alone, exhausted, when your defenses are down. That is the Amalek pattern in your life. And God's command has not changed. Do not spare it. Do not keep the best parts. Do not negotiate with it. Blot it out. Amalek attacked when Israel was weakest. Amalek returned when Israel forgot. Amalek thrived when kings compromised. Amalek survived when obedience was partial. Amalek died when one woman refused to be silent. Finish the fight. Close your eyes for 3 seconds. What is the thing you have been sparing? The habit, the relationship, the compromise you keep calling harmless? Name it. Now hear what God said. Do not spare it. Next week we trace another bloodline, one that started with a single lie in a garden and ended with a body hanging on a tree. Subscribe now, because that video will change how you read every page between Genesis 3 and Calvary. And tell me in the comments, which moment hit you hardest? Was it Timnah's rejection? Gideon alone in the winepress? Samuel doing what the king would not? Or Esther removing her jewelry before walking to her death? I read every comment. Remember where we started. A Persian throne room, a noose, a man in royal robes ascending steps. Now you know the 1,500 years behind that image. One rejected woman, one cowardly attack on the helpless, 4 centuries of teeth, one king who flinched, one queen who did not. God does not forget what you keep sparing. Blot it out, or it will build gallows for you. Finish the fight.